Hi, it's John. Thanks for joining us today. I'm really thrilled to be joined by somebody I've been following for the last 5 years and think is doing great stuff. It's Sangeet Paul Choudary. He is the founder of Platformation Labs, and he's written a few good books, but two I want to highlight are Platform Revolution and then Platform Scale. And I'd like to welcome our guest today, Sangeet Paul Choudary. Hi, Sangeet.
Hey, John. Good to be here. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks again for taking the time. I know you're over in Singapore and it's getting a little bit late, but the lockdown doesn't keep you inside, so I'm sure you could be doing other things, so thank you. For those who haven't had a chance to read your book yet, which is on a lot of bestseller lists, do you want to just give us a quick introduction to your body of work and where you are now with things?
Right. So my work largely focuses on the idea of platform business models, and I contrast the idea of platforms from how traditional models used to work, which were what I call pipelines, where businesses would create value, push it out to the customer, and run product and service-based business models. Platforms instead organize an ecosystem of producers and consumers around themselves to create and exchange value with each other. And this idea of platform business models has gained a lot of traction over the last decade in particular. Most of the stock market returns in recent times have been driven by platform business models. Every industry, for that matter, is now moving towards platform business models. So we're at a point where this shift towards platforms is now much more widely understood than when I started out working in this direction. So over the last 5 to 6 years, a lot of my work has been in terms of understanding and explaining further nuances around how you think about platforms. What are the kinds of dark side or the negative effects of platforms that we need to be aware of? How do you think about regulating platforms? How do you think about moving traditional value chains and in the direction of platform-based ecosystems and identifying new opportunities for such business models at different parts of the value chain, not just closer to the customer, but all across the value chain. So a lot of my work has been in explaining these ideas, working with companies who are looking to move in the direction of platform businesses, helping regulators regulate some of these businesses, and personally investing in a lot of these platform companies.
That's great. Really broad set of work you've done, Sangeet, and we'll provide links to your a lot more about your bio because I think there's probably just too much and will overwhelm people. You've been doing a lot, as you hinted at. I wanted to really focus on your latest work that you've put out that's getting a lot of attention. That's the Platform Revolution report for 2021. Do you want to quickly introduce that, and then maybe we can touch on some of the major points you brought up in it?
Yeah, so the idea of this end of year report was that 2020 as a year was really unique, and it kind of gave a new acceleration to the platform economy. And so this report identifies 9 key themes that gained rapid acceleration in 2020, which I believe will be very important over the next 4 to 5 years. Some of the key themes that this report talks about is the idea that because of the pandemic, we are now seeing shifts in value pools. We're seeing entirely new business opportunities coming up because of a rapid shift in demand patterns, demand behavior on the demand side, or because of a rapid shift in how the negotiation power in the value chain works. And I can give a few examples of that, but that's one big shift that we've seen happen over the last 1 year. Another big shift has been just a shift towards countries following more of a platform strategy, and China is one of the best examples of that, which I'm happy to get into in detail as well. But just to think about the high-level themes, some of the other key themes that this report talks about is the growing inequality in the platform economy, where the players who are actually building these platforms, the engineers and product managers in these companies, are benefiting inordinately from the gains of the success of these platforms, whereas those working in the ecosystem, the driver on Uber or the food delivery guy on, say, a Deliveroo, these are the guys who are increasingly being commoditized. And so that's, again, one of the big themes. And then the interplay between how platforms interact with traditional companies, how platforms interact with governments, those are key themes as well. And one of the final themes that is quite interesting that I talk about is the idea of platform cartels, where these platforms are not just becoming really big. So think of Facebook, Google, Amazon, really big, huge companies, even $1 trillion companies, but more importantly, they're also organizing among themselves to create rules and governance mechanisms which give some kind of a catalyzation effect to how these platforms coordinate with each other. So these are some of the key issues that this report talks about, and I'm happy to go into all of these issues in detail as you'd like to.
Just to start things off and give our audience a foundation for the discussion, how would you introduce the topic of platforms for people that aren't more familiar with it?
So the idea of platforms, as I mentioned, is fundamentally a distinction from how traditional industrial business models worked, where industrial business models were centered around creating products, pushing them out, and delivering these products to customers. And the business model was very straightforward. The customer paid for the product, and the product was delivered to the customer, and the business was over. And what platforms do instead is they don't create a product or a service, they fundamentally create an open infrastructure in which external parties, both producers and consumers of value, can connect and interact with each other. They then set the rules of governance for these producers and consumers as they interact with each other to guide those interactions. So some of the most common examples of platforms are what we see close to the customer, things like Airbnb versus a traditional hotel, where Airbnb connects the producers and consumers of lodging with each other, or think of, for that matter, something like Amazon, which connects third-party merchants with consumers while also managing its own retail business as a pipeline. It also extends in the direction of a platform. But we've really seen three different shifts in the rise of the platform economy, if you will. A lot of the initial platforms, I would say anything built prior to 2010, derived a lot of its value just from the network activity. So it derived a lot of value just from connecting a lot of various stakeholders together. A lot of the platforms over the last decade have derived most of their value from data. So a classic example is, think of MySpace in the early 2000s, and Facebook now. The value, while the network is much bigger in Facebook, the value really is in the data. Or think of traditional classifieds business, which connected a lot of buyers and sellers, but today marketplaces really create value through reputation systems and data. And what we're now seeing is kind of a third wave in this platform economy, where it's no longer just about connecting producers and consumers or understanding consumers really well. It's actually about identifying opportunities in every part of the value chain to modularize every component of the value chain and reorganize them in platform-based models. So if I give an example of that, think of a company like Smart Car. Smart Car is a company in the automotive industry which converts every element of a vehicle into an API. So you could check if you want to check the fuel efficiency, that's an API. If you want to check how the tire is performing, that's an API. So every element of the vehicle is now converted into an API. That gets open. New applications can be created around that. But now each of these APIs can be recombined with other sources of data and create entirely new innovation on top of that. So if you think of something like that, you've kind of really created entirely new value beyond just the market participants. You've unbundled the very components of a product, the very components of a value chain, to now allow the organization into a whole new range of services. So how platforms create value is constantly expanding beyond just the network, just the data, to now every component of the value chain. And so the more we go into it, the more layers we can peel of this onion. But fundamentally, the idea of a platform across all of this is that it creates an open infrastructure where third parties can connect producers and consumers, and it provides the mechanisms to govern their interactions.
Yeah, thank you for peeling a few layers of that onion. It really is fascinating. I mean, first of all, as we talk about acceleration and the corporate life cycle speeding up, but then when it comes to the platform dynamics and how that's evolving so quickly, it's really, really fascinating. I just wanted to check quickly, would you like to touch on the idea of a country as a platform in China? Or should we save that a little bit later when we talk about some of the cartels?
Right. So the idea of country as a platform is really interesting. It basically is this idea that platform companies fundamentally do three things, as I mentioned. One is they create these open infrastructures and where external parties can connect. The second thing that they do is they govern these interactions, but we can break that second piece down into two elements. There are two ways in which they manage this governance. The first is by creating standards so that there's consensus in terms of how various parts of the industry, various parts of the value chain work with the platform. And the second piece in governance is setting up the right control points so that you are, as the platform owner, at the center of this ecosystem. You are not somebody that can be bypassed because you have a control point, you have a key resource that every other player desires. So think of Facebook data as a key control point because advertisers need to go through Facebook's targeting mechanisms to reach consumers, and consumers need to interact through Facebook because Facebook uses their data to connect them with the right content. Or if you think of Android, Google Maps is a really important control point because every phone needs a mapping capability, and Google owns the best maps. Google is able to exert control over the Android ecosystem. So if we extend this idea further, this idea of open infrastructure, standards, and control points, today countries are setting up platform strategies around doing these three things in a very concerted, strategic fashion. And China is one of the best examples of this because China, especially in the area of trade and payments, is doing all these three things. It's creating new infrastructure, exporting it out to other countries, creating or investing in creation of new standards, and beyond that, setting up key control points so that the flows that emerge as more and more countries adopt the infrastructure, adopt the standards, China sits centrally in all these flows. So if I give a simple example of this, Alibaba's position in China is very strategic to this whole strategy, to this whole approach of country as a platform. Alibaba at this point provides trade infrastructure in the form of what is called the Electronic World Trade Platform, through which it sets up digital free trade zones in different countries. It's set that up in Malaysia, in Rwanda, in Belgium, and then it onboards small businesses to conduct trade, to participate in international trade, international digital trade through these digital free trade zones. And then it connects all of this trade activity back to the trade hub in China. And through this, it's by setting up hubs around the world, it's creating this global trade infrastructure. And this works really well with China because China, for its own part, has been working a lot in standards development with the WTO to create new standards for digital trade. It's been setting up new dispute resolution courts, judicial systems in China to manage this international trade. And then supporting this trade is what, say, Ant Financial, Alibaba's sister company owned by Jack Ma again, is doing in the space of payments, where they're exporting their financial infrastructure to banks and payment wallets across the world so that more and more financial activity in different countries now starts working through Alibaba and Ant Financial's infrastructure. And so in all of this, Alibaba and Ant Financial own key control points at the back end. Whenever a loan has to be given to, say, a farmer in Pakistan, if the company already works on Alibaba Cloud and has been digitally transformed using Alibaba's technology stack, they can also use Alibaba's credit scoring algorithm to give that loan to the farmer. And that in turn keeps improving Alibaba's data advantage. So if you think of how China positions itself around the trade and payments infrastructure that Alibaba and Ant Financial have been putting out there, that's one example of a country as a platform strategy. And in addition to Ant Financial expanding globally, China, which has this ambition of moving trade away from US dollars to the Chinese currency, has also been pushing the idea of digital fiat currency. And as you know, the more we see currencies moving in that direction, the more we see trade moving in that direction, or the more we see the Belt and Road countries around China adopting, say, China's digital fiat or some of the payments infrastructure that we talked about, the more trade volumes then now start shifting away from US dollars based trade to Chinese currency based trade. So that's a big part of what China wants to do with its country as a platform strategy. And then there are two other pillars. I don't want to go into that in detail, but just to kind of create the whole picture, the two other pillars to this country, the platform strategy, are national identity programs, where China has been creating very sophisticated identity management systems and exporting that to other countries. Venezuela's Father Card program is a great example of that. And the fourth thing is in the space of urban infrastructure, digital urban infrastructure, especially given China's advantage with 5G. So again, Alibaba, Huawei, and other companies have been building or been at the forefront of a lot of smart city implementations around the world. And that, again, export of smart city infrastructure coupled with the data that is captured from that is, again, a big part of their country as a platform strategy.
Tons of fascinating points you touched on there, and I want to maybe pick up a couple of them when we are wrapping up at the end. But before I get caught up too much in that, something we were talking about a little bit earlier is the impact of COVID. But you've mentioned in your report the idea of value pool shifts, and in particular used the example of the movie industry. Could you share a little bit of insight from that point?
Yeah, so the idea of the value pool shift is really important given what's happened with the pandemic. So in general, value pools keep shifting whenever there's a sudden shift in demand or a sudden shift in supply. And what's happened because of the pandemic is that across industries, we've seen a big shift in demand. And in some industries, we've also seen a similar or a concerted shift in supply side dynamics. So the movie industry is one great example of that because owing to the lockdown, movie distribution moved away from theaters to streaming. And that's a sudden shift in demand that was unanticipated, that could not have been engineered in any other fashion. And so there's a sudden shift in demand that's now sustained for several months, close to a year now. And if we think of demand in itself, if there was no supply side shift, you could say that demand is elastic, and once movie theaters reopen, people would want to get back to it even more than they did before. But what happens alongside this is that there's also a shift in supply side dynamics, because traditionally movie studios had this agreement of a release window with major theaters where they would agree to not launch the movie on other channels while it was being launched in the theater. And now, with theaters losing that level of distribution leverage, movie studios are now able to renegotiate that and are setting up new distribution deals with streaming companies. A great example of this is the distribution deal that one of the first distribution deals last year that happened in China, where there was a licensing plus an advertising distribution deal with one of the streaming players. But essentially, what this leads to is that if theaters stay shut for long and the window essentially gets gradually eroded, and in the meantime, if movie studios figure out a sustainable way to keep launching with the streaming players, the shift in movie distribution could end up becoming permanent. So while demand in itself is elastic, the combination of demand and supply side shifts could create an entirely new value pool that goes in the direction of the streaming companies and erodes the value that a theater would normally capture. So that's an example of how a combination of a demand side shift and a supply side shift could fundamentally shift value away in a new direction.
Really, really interesting to see how that's playing out. I think GameStop was another example where people thought it was pretty clear that an old industry was going to be disrupted by COVID. But where are there some examples of what companies are well established are doing or can do to respond to this type of shift? What can we look to?
I think if you think about in general how traditional companies respond to platform businesses coming in, there are certain scenarios where it's just difficult to adequately respond to a shift towards platform-based business. And if you look at the impact that Amazon has had on much of US retail, that's a great example of, no matter what you do, it's difficult to respond to a platform coming into the industry. Or if you look at Apple and Google coming into telecom and taking application distribution away from handset manufacturers, which companies like Nokia and BlackBerry used to dominate. That's another great example of how traditional companies find it very difficult to respond. But if you just look at telecom, and this is the second theme in the report that I've launched, telecom in itself had been written off as an industry where platforms had completely rewritten the game, because there have been two rounds of disruption. The first was Apple and Google taking power away from handset manufacturers, and the second was WhatsApp and other communication companies like Skype and other communication products moving value away from the traditional telecommunications businesses, because those businesses invested in infrastructure and subsidized that by charging a high margin on the actual data services that they ran on top of the infrastructure. And with WhatsApp and with Viber and some of these other companies, Skype coming in, all of that revenue started getting eroded for these telecom companies. So for the past decade or so, we've talked about how the telecom industry has been losing revenue. But if you look at this example, one of the best examples of a traditional company responding to value shifts and new platforms coming in is what Reliance did in the last 10 years, in the last year, over the last 12 months in particular. Reliance, since 2014 or so, has been pursuing a strategy towards creating an alternate economic model for how the telecommunications industry works. So Reliance is traditionally been one of the biggest oil and gas companies in India, and now when it entered into telecommunications, what it did was a lot of the traditional infrastructure in India was still 2G in the early 2010s and was beginning to move towards 3G, but Reliance invested in 4G and took a $30 billion loan to really map out 4G infrastructure across the country. And once that was done, it launched a really cheap phone, a really cheap feature phone, which was not built on Android or any of these other big platforms, so that it did not depend too much on one of these other platforms as such. Reliance built a really cheap feature phone, gained nearly 400 million subscribers in a very short period of time because it subsidized voice and data by using 4G. 4G, fundamentally, the economics of voice become very different because voice becomes yet another form of data product as opposed to 2G and 3G. And so Reliance essentially subsidized voice and launched very cheap voice packages on a very cheap phone, which allowed it to penetrate a huge portion of the population in India. And as a result of this, there was a big price war, and most companies either consolidated or they wound up because they just could not compete on these economics using their 2G and 3G infrastructure. And so essentially what Reliance ended up doing was it ended up shifting power in its direction. In 2020, Reliance, with this 400 million subscriber base or so, opened out its capital structure and allowed Facebook, Google, and Qualcomm, Intel, and several other companies to invest in it. And in doing so, it wrote off that whole. It got them essentially got these strategic investors to pay off that $30 billion debt, but also got them to create the remaining portions of this strategy, because Reliance did a really good job on getting the infrastructure layer right, getting the voice and commoditizing all of these layers so that other telcos could not compete with it. But now it needs to capture value on top of it in services, and that's where the partnership with Facebook comes in, and Facebook would essentially be launching WhatsApp as a commerce channel on top of this technology that Reliance has built up. The partnership with Google ends up helping Reliance move to a smartphone, because most of these 400 million users had been on the feature phone. And so essentially what we see in this example is that if, as a traditional company, you want to compete, you really have to rethink the economics of the industry. You cannot just do more of what you've already been doing or what your peers have already been doing and expect to respond to platforms. And what Reliance did even better was it created a vehicle for creating a partnership with other large platform companies. And to a large extent, most traditional incumbents miss these things. They, if you talk to one of the telcos out there, they would normally look at what other telcos are doing, how they can keep competing with them for an ever shrinking pie. Nobody tries to rethink the economics and rethink what a business model would look like if their traditional business were to be commoditized. And in that sense, because they don't commoditize themselves, somebody else ends up doing that. So Reliance is a good example of a company that commoditized the traditional model of that business and then shifted value in another direction, and then got the strategic investors who can bring in that value to now create the full business model. So that's one of my favorite examples of a traditional company getting this right.
I think it's a great example, and it's interesting to see how that one continues to develop. I'm a big fan of these more independent entities, and as you say, the platform approach. So great that you could share that. There were two other industries that I thought would be worth talking about. I don't know if we have time to get into healthcare, because that's a big one here with everything going on with COVID. But as you can imagine, I'm keen to hear what you think about platforms and financial services in a bit more detail, and how tech companies are there. Do you want to pick where to start and what you want to dive into on those two?
Sure. I'm happy to talk about financial services, as that might be more relevant to a lot of the audience on the podcast. So, if you look at financial services, there are a few different factors that have moved the industry towards a platform economy. The first is that open banking and deregulation with PSD2 and other open banking directives has led to traditional financial services becoming APIs. And essentially, when you when you start seeing the key value sources in an industry start moving towards APIs, those APIs can now be unbundled from their traditional sources of distribution and be rebundled into other places where they can be redistributed. So the traditional form of distribution would be, if you had a loan, you would distribute it through the retail bank, or you would distribute an insurance through an insurance agent. But now, once all of these things become APIs, you can distribute them through a whole range of different models. Now, this distribution point becomes even more interesting because traditionally banks have always captured the secondary demand. Banks have captured a demand for the loan, or the demand for a mortgage, but they've not actually captured the primary demand, which is the demand for a house or the demand for a car. Even payments is secondary demand. The primary demand is the actual thing that you're paying for. So what we're seeing is that platforms tend to capture a lot of the primary demand. And because platforms capture primary demand, whether it's a real estate platform capturing the kind of data that helps them determine what kind of house you're interested in, or it's an e-commerce platform capturing your actual retail activity, these platforms now become sources through which financial services can be distributed. And as I mentioned in the first theme that I talked about, financial services are becoming more distributable because of becoming APIs. So if you bring these two things together, platforms are becoming really important in the financial services industry. But if we go beyond this, there are many other factors that are leading to the rise of platforms in the financial services industry. Financial services infrastructure at the back end is fundamentally changing. We're seeing companies like Plaid, Tink, and so on coming in and fundamentally changing the core banking infrastructure and how that interacts with external parties and external ecosystems. And we're also seeing new API aggregators coming up in between the core banking infrastructure at the back end and the distribution side at the front end. There are large API aggregators, what are called banking as a service platforms, coming in and aggregating APIs from many different stakeholders and allowing them to be rebundled into many different distribution channels. So these are all opportunities for new platforms to come in. If you, on top of this, think about the shifts that have come with COVID. In particular, we've seen the rise of contactless payments. In certain countries, contactless has completely taken off in a way that was not possible pre-COVID. And contactless payments is another very interesting shift in how financial services could be distributed or even embedded, because what contactless payments does is it decouples the payment from the card and from the terminal. In the past, you had to insert the card into the terminal. That's how payment would happen. With contactless, you could embed the payment origination into anything. It could be a card, it could be a phone, and you could embed the payment acceptance into anything. It could be a terminal, it could be any object. And once you think of that, the implications of that are profound, because if the payment origination and the payment acceptance can be embedded anywhere, you can now start having true machine to machine payments, something that's been technological possible for the last 10 years. And a lot of companies have talked about it and have wanted to do it. But you really needed this whole shift towards contactless to happen before this could happen. So it's all of these shifts that are really driving the rise of platform based solutions in the financial services industry. And payments, I believe, is always an important core and important starting point around which you can rebundle a lot of financial services, because payments allows you to capture a lot of data. So if you think of some of the biggest platforms today in financial services, Ant Financial, Square, Stripe, these are all payments companies that used data from the payment activity, then the bundle lending, treasury, other kinds of services around the first core payment use case. So that's really why I feel that this is an important time for financial services and for platforms and financial services in particular.
I totally agree. That's hopefully obvious. Something I've experienced over my time in the fintech community is essentially that there's a real balancing act when it comes to regulation. You have the factor of incumbents in large banks that relatively have a pretty captive audience with regulators. And then you have these new players, the fintech companies. But beyond that, as we've talked about a few times, there's industry convergence and very big new agile players from the tech industry and other parts of the world that are coming into it. What are some of your thoughts around how platforms are changing the way we regulate business?
So one important piece around the rise of platforms is that platforms themselves have created some of the biggest challenges to regulation, because traditional regulation was focused on regulating monopolies that were focused on price extraction. And so the moment you look at platforms, you see these big companies which look like monopolies, but then they don't charge consumers. And so a lot of the traditional regulatory playbook goes out of the window. So one of the key challenges right now, I'd say there are three or four key challenges right now in terms of how to think about regulation of platforms. The first thing is to go beyond just traditional monopoly regulation and think about how platforms create or engage in anti-competitive practices in 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 models that were not possible in the past, or models that were not possible traditionally. And fundamentally, there's one central principle that determines how competition has changed in the age of platforms and more broadly in the age of technology. And that is that when you start moving, when an industry starts becoming more digitized, what ends up happening is that value shifts to certain layers of the industry and complementary layers tend to become a commodity. And the reason for that is and this concentration and commoditization, this is by design. This is in the very economics and the nature of how technology operates. The way technology operates is that if you want to aggregate data and gain more intelligence out of that data, you want a lot of players to adopt your standards, to adopt your technology. And so you have to commoditize all the technology that needs to be distributed in order for that data to be concentrated with you. And this is what we see repeatedly. A lot of the services that we use, Facebook, for instance, Amazon, a lot of these services fundamentally do not have an access fee. And that is because you commoditize the service so that you can get access to the data and centralize the data. Similarly, you think of Apple. Apple commoditizes the application. Prior to Apple, nobody sold software for 99 cents, but Apple commoditizes the application so that the value of the phone increases. On the other hand, Google commoditizes the phone so that the value of so that more and more people get access to the phone, and Google is able to make money through advertising and other mechanisms. So my point is that when you think about competition in technology in general, it's very difficult to think of competition in a bounded box and say this is how we define the industry and this is how competition is taking place within it. You have to think about complements. You have to think about what are the various complements that surround a particular profit pool for a company, and how is the company performing not in the profit pool activities but in the complementary activities. And then you have to regulate with that whole picture in mind. If you regulate it just with the profit pool activities in mind, then you may not end up regulating this in the right way. And if you regulate just the complements which are being offered for free, then the traditional monopoly regulation playbook also goes out the window. So this piece is really important to understand. The second piece that's very important to understand in terms of regulation is also whether some of these platforms and technologies, they're empowering the ecosystem or they're commoditizing the ecosystem. And this again comes from the point that in certain markets it makes sense for it makes it, it makes logical and business sense for the platform in between to organize the market activity by commoditizing the various participants, by standardizing their behavior. And a good example of this is Uber. Uber commoditizes the driver, and so the driver is not able to set the price. The price is set by the platform. Think of Airbnb on the other hand. Airbnb relatively empowers the host to set up the price, to do some level of price discrimination based on the kind of property, based on the kind of market that they are playing in, and all of these things then determine the impact that the platform has on the ecosystem. So when we think of regulation, we need to think through all of these aspects in terms of how competition plays out in a business where you may commoditize a lot of the business and capture value somewhere else. To think of how the platform or the central business has an impact on the ecosystem, not just in terms of the price that it's charging, but also in terms of the ability or the extent to which it's allowing free choice in that ecosystem and so on. So there are a whole range of these new issues that start coming up when we start thinking about regulations in the age of the platform economy.
Indeed, and something that touches on that, I think, quite importantly, is the whole idea of inequality when we bring it down to an individual level.
Right.
What are some of your thoughts on that, and how it relates to the future of work for people?
Yeah, I think as more of work moves towards platform businesses, as we see with companies like Upwork, even Uber and Deliveroo, and so on, as more work moves in the direction of platforms, we need to see how we need to see two things in particular. First, what is the level of free choice and free agency that the workers have, the participants have in these ecosystems? And the example that I just gave, Uber versus Airbnb, who gets to set the price, who gets to set the terms of engagement? I did a deep dive on this with the ILO a couple of years back, which goes into all the various factors that you need to consider to determine whether inequality will be increased by a platform or whether it will be managed and decreased. So I think that there are two key aspects of inequality, as I mentioned. There's above the algorithm inequality versus below the algorithm. Who is coding the platform versus who is working inside it? That's one part of it. So the engineers versus the Uber drivers. And the second inequality happens within the ecosystem. If you come in early to a platform, you may think of Twitter for an example. You may get a lot of followers, and there's actually a lot of documented evidence that people who were interns in Twitter in 2008 to 2010, in that period, summer interns, they ended up uh, gaining, hundreds of thousands of followers, because Twitter at the time was releasing a feature which was people you may want to follow, and a lot of the interns around that time were, set up their own profiles and gained a lot of followers at that time. Now that is clearly something that you'd call unfair advantage, and that unfair advantage may accrue to you either because you are again above the algorithm, you're part of the company, you're closer to the source, or because you're early on a platform. So this unfair advantage is rarely meritocratic. And if you think of it as just Twitter followers, it may not seem like a big deal. But if you think of the fact that a lot of these players have ended up becoming big business people, that clearly gave them a head start. If you think of then applying this to, say, a freelancing platform, you could again see that this would create unfair advantage again and lead to random arbitrary inequality. So there are all these considerations to think about. There is fundamentally the structural inequality of above the algorithm versus below the algorithm actors. There's inequality within the ecosystem depending on whether the platform commoditizes your skills or empowers your skills, and then there's arbitrary inequality that gets created because of the examples I just mentioned.
I have to say, it's really great work that you've done to define all this stuff. It becomes very helpful with the fast-moving topic. It's a bit like a map. Um, One of the topics I wanted to end up around here was the idea of what a lot of people market as digital ecosystems. There's some digital ecosystems around individuals, like health and wellness applications and things like that, personal assistance. There's ones around the home or around the car. You talk about platform cartels. Can you tell us a little bit more of the dynamic, whatever the name of how these different organizations start to work?
I talk about the idea of platform cartels because traditional cartels in the oil industry or in any natural resource industry for that matter worked on the principles of collaborating or coordinating around price, around output, and based on that uh, they would manage their negotiating power in the value chain. What platform cartels do is they don't necessarily negotiate around these traditional industrial age production parameters. They coordinate around how they govern the ecosystem, and that could potentially have bigger impact than just production based coordination. Because when you think about, say, platforms making the decision to ban somebody, and Trump being banned from a whole range of platforms in the last month was one such example of this coming to the fore, where if platforms coordinate and decide that they want to ban somebody, that person can suddenly see their entire influence being removed. Now, this is not to say or not to pass a value judgment on whether Trump should be banned or not banned. That's besides the point. The real question is whether platforms should have this kind of power to coordinate among themselves and fundamentally cut off somebody's influence, monetization power completely. Today, it's a politician. Tomorrow, it could be a small business owner. Going forward, it could be something else. But all of these platforms work on reputation systems. They capture data, and they're all prone to what you'd call false positives. Somebody who should not be banned gets banned. And then when they start coordinating around this and when they start cartelizing around this, that banning can be even bigger. So that is the challenge when platforms start coordinating. Even during the rise of COVID, we saw Apple and Google, for all the right reasons, create a contact tracing infrastructure by coordinating among themselves. But while today that contact tracing infrastructure is not in the hands of or is not being used or being abused in any way apart from contact tracing, imagine a scenario where, say, a law enforcement agency got access to such a contact tracing infrastructure and was able to trace all the people who were around a certain corpse after a murder incident, and that could lead to all kinds of false positives again. So the problem with platforms is that there's a central point of failure, and if you expose that central point of failure, that could then be abused in a whole range of mechanisms. When you then allow these platforms to cartelize, that central point of failure gets magnified even further. So that's the fundamental issue when platforms start cartelizing like this.
Very interesting. I don't know if you have any thoughts on what Facebook had done with, apparently it's not exactly a cryptocurrency. It used to be called Libra, and now it's called Diem. Have you looked at that at all, and do you have some thoughts on what they've done with pushing that forward?
Yeah, so Facebook again. I talked about the idea of commoditizing the complement or making something open, and Facebook essentially set up Libra as this consortium of 100 different companies, which included even companies like Visa, PayPal, and so on. And the idea was through that to gain widespread adoption on Libra. But the real game that Facebook had was not Libra. It was something called Calibra, which was essentially the closed wallet that would work only for Facebook users. And through that, with Facebook's 2 billion users, also with merchants and Shopify merchants and so on, that would create its own little economy. And if you then combine it with Facebook's identity management system, through which you can log into a whole range of sites and applications. Now, if you connect that with a commercial element, Facebook could become the identity manager for not just the social web, but the commercial web. So I believe that was the bigger picture around which Facebook went after Libra and Calibra. But for all the right reasons, it was pushed back when it went forward with this initial idea of the consortium. I haven't looked at DM in a lot of detail, but whatever Facebook has been doing over the last few years, their whole goal of monetizing WhatsApp, their whole goal of think of yeah, setting up WhatsApp Pay, and then also the idea of Calibra. All of this points to the fact that eventually Facebook wants to be a big player in commerce, and um, there are two ways to play in commerce. You could be completely closed and create a closed loop system, or you could invest in creating a standard and create a closed loop system around it, so that the more the standard gets adopted, the more your closed loop system also gets adopted. So I believe that with Libra, that's really what they've been trying to do. They've been trying to create that open standard, which then allows them to capture in a closed loop system through WhatsApp Pay, through Calibra, and so on, a lot of the value that comes from Libra's expansion.
Yeah, interesting. Well, we're talking with them next week, so I'll be sure to share the interview as much as possible. We're getting a little bit long, and I know this is a ton of information for people to absorb. So I thought this would be a good point to start wrapping things up. I don't know if you had other points you wanted to mention, which of course I'd welcome you to do now, but I was hoping you could say a little bit more about the Platform Institute specifically.
The starting point would be diving deeper into the State of the Platform Revolution 2021 report that you'd find in the links over here. The Platform Institute is essentially it's essentially a self-served program where I provide the entire program that I usually provide to corporates, that is now available in a self-serve e-learning model, where you can go through each and every element of how to think about a platform, how to strategize around a platform, how to design the platform, and how to launch and scale it. So if you're building a platform, that's really where the Platform Institute becomes relevant. And there are the whole range of programs that we run from time to time, targeting different kinds of stakeholders around the Platform Institute. So you can have a look at it, and once you sign up, there's a whole range of other programs that get launched around it as well.
Great, and we'll have a discount that you and your team were kind enough to organize for our audience, so thank you again for that. And Sangeet, before we let you get on with your evening there in Singapore, are there any last words for our audience?
Over the next 10 years, the platform economy is going to become even more important than it's been in the last decade. What's going to change is how these platforms create value and how they compete with the existing models of value creation. So as I mentioned, platforms, a lot of the value that we're going to see in the next 10 years is going to be around digitizing different parts of the value chain, unbundling them and rebundling them in different kinds of business models. The examples with the financial services industry being one such instance. So if you're an entrepreneur, if you're looking for opportunities, a lot of the opportunities would not lie close to the customer. They would lie further up the value chain, and that is something that a lot of us miss as we look at new opportunities in the platform economy. But over the next several years, I believe that's where a lot of the opportunities will lie. On the other hand, as an investor, I guess most investors have had a great time over the last decade. If you look at how Netflix, Facebook, Google, all of them grew over the last decade, I believe that over the next decade, we are also starting to see just the early signs of some of the next big players coming in right now. So it's again a really exciting time to be both an entrepreneur and an investor in this economy.
I couldn't agree more, Sangeet. Thank you so much. I'll let you go at that, and just remind everybody, this is Sangeet Paul Choudary who's joined us today. He is the founder of Platformation Labs. He's also the author of a number of best-selling books, and I encourage you to check them out and find the discount the team has provided for us. So again, Sangeet, thank you for everything, and all the best for the final days of COVID, let's hope. Take care.
Thank you, John. Thank you. Bye.